Hello and welcome to That's Wild, a podcast series brought to you by the National Parks Board. I'm Elliot and I'm your host for this series, where we'll be talking to special guests from the nature community about topics surrounding biodiversity conservation in our city and nature. In today's episode, we'll be discussing one of the world's top global crimes. According to Interpol, this crime sector is valued at $20 billion a year. It is the illegal wildlife trade. Today we have Renhui and Jessica with us here. Could you guys introduce a bit about yourselves?
Hi, Elliot. I'm Renhui, Director of Wildlife Trade in National Parks Board. Happy to be here.
I'm Jessica from Mandai Nature. I head the bird conservation programs as well as those that tackle the illegal wildlife trade. And in a separate head, I help coordinate the efforts of the IUCN SSC Asian Songbird Trade Specialist Group.
Thank you for joining us, guys. I'm really excited to talk about this topic today. I think the illegal wildlife trade is something that is quite overlooked in conservation, even though it's quite a huge issue. I think one of the statistics that always stands out to me is that it's the fourth biggest international crime. Correct me if I'm wrong, after drug trafficking, human trafficking, and
right.
money laundering, right?
Yeah.
So I thought maybe we could start with talking about, what you guys have brought here today. I see you guys have brought some items to kind of set the scene for what we're going to discuss.
Yeah, so I brought with me 3 companions, 3 soft toys. I've got a little Straw-headed Bulbul soft toy, a white ram shama soft toy, or plushie, as some people call it, and a hill miner. And one common thing that runs across these 3 birds is they're all songbirds. And unfortunately, they're all also traded in the legal and unsustainable wildlife trade.
Right. And anything particularly interesting about the 3 of them ecology-wise?
Yeah. So all 3 birds are also Singaporean. So you can find them here in Singapore, but also wider Southeast Asia.
Right. Cool. And I think the Straw-headed Bulbul in recent years has got a lot of media publicity, right?
Yeah. I often call it the Singapore special. So the global population of Straw-headed Bulbuls come up to about 1,700 birds in the wild. And Singapore is estimated to have about 1/3 of the whole world's population here in the island country, making us one of the strongholds of the species.
And Renhui, I understand you also work on these species of songbirds. Maybe we could get to know a bit more of your work on them.
Yeah, sure, Elliot. So with me, I have a tote bag. On it has a straw-headed bulbul drawing. And we got our youth to draw this artwork so that we can go around to inform our international community the threats that are being faced by such songbirds and the amount of protection or changes to legislation we can do to give that sort of protection that the birds actually require in our region. So that's what I have, and I bring it all around with me.
Oh, wow.
And I think Renhui mentioned a very good point, and that is the fact that it's drawn by youth, which shows that young people, right, could also get involved.
Yeah, and I think it's important to get them involved, right?
And just one more thing that I wanted to add is a collaboration with NParks and Mandai. Everybody to Panama.
Singapore, Boleh.
So we brought this back to an international meeting, the Conference of Parties, that happens every 3 years by the international committee CITES. So at the meeting, we see that there's increased attention on protections on songbird, particularly species in our region. It's one of the big meetings that we needed government agencies to be there, as well as Mandai as a non-governmental organization that resulted in the successful uplisting of Straw-headed Bulbul to CITES Appendix 1. Right. Yep. And that really means there will be no more commercial trade internationally for Straw-headed Bulbul. So in a way, it addresses illegal trade in Straw-headed Bulbul, because once a customs officer sees Straw-headed Bulbul being transported or moving across border, commercial trade is not allowed. So it has to come with a necessary set of paperwork. And it does allow the enforcement officers to hold it and then to do further investigation.
And I think the other great thing about having a bird on a listing like CITES, which is a convention of the international trade of wild flora and fauna, a multilateral intergovernmental convention, is that you can track the birds, because birds need permit, they need paperwork, there's records keeping. Previously, if the bird isn't on CITES, it may be tracked by agencies, but it's not tracked at international levels, or at least it's not enforceable. So now countries are expected to put information online. Yeah.
And also just to add is that there are more than 180 countries on this international convention. So it's a convention that all countries or most countries will need to put in necessary legislation to fulfill the obligation or the decisions that were made at CITES. So I would say it's one of the more powerful international instruments available to give protection to wildlife species.
Maybe I wanted to know a bit more about, what is the illegal songbird trade? Just for our listeners, just really setting the stage for what this trade looks like, what's driving it, and what birds? I mean, we've talked about 3 different species, but I'm quite sure there are a lot more that are being traded.
Yep, I'm happy to start off on that. Maybe just for our listeners to know, when we say songbird, we typically refer to a passerine, which is a perching bird. And for context, out of the roughly 10,000 known species of birds globally, passerines or songbirds form 6,000. So 60% of the world's birds, right, are all songbirds. But within this songbird category, there's a subset that really sing, the true songbirds. And these are found right across the world. And as far as we know from data, almost every single songbird globally is traded in one form or the other. And yet, less than 10% of songbird species in the world are protected. The exception being the few that we mentioned here, actually all 3 that we talked about, the Straw-headed Bulbul, the white-rumped sham, and the hill miner, are on, say, an international listing like CITES, but most of them aren't, which means that most of the trade aren't even tracked, right? They're only tracked when there's time to track or when there's other requirements to track the trade, but certainly not from an international perspective. And songbirds, we said earlier, right, they're threatened by things like habitat loss and, climate change or some, bigger, broader factors. But the illegal and unsustainable wildlife trade is certainly one of the biggest threats to Southeast Asian songbirds. And songbirds are traded and kept for all kinds of reasons. In some instances, people just want a companion bird to have, and songbirds sing very nicely, so it's nice to have a nice singing bird in a cage in your house that you wake up to every day. And then there's also certain cultural reasons. Certain cultures in Southeast Asia, keeping animal like a songbird is part of what makes them, identify as that members of that particular cultural identity. Songbirds are also hunted in wider Asia for food. Best example being the yellow-breasted bunting. Used to be found in the millions across Asia, but it's now down to the hundreds. So it's actually critically endangered and largely consumed, so as food rather than as pets. And I think a practice that is really, really entrenched in Southeast Asian culture and maybe more obvious here than elsewhere in the world is the practice of songbird competitions.
Right.
So where songbirds are kept and trained to be songsters, and they go into this competition arenas and compete with other songbirds from other people, right? And the winning songbird often, gets the prestige, social status, and in some instances, prizes. And so these are just some of the factors, in Southeast Asia at least, that drives the songbird trade.
Right. So Southeast Asia and Singapore also, right? I think
The Straw-headed Bulbul particularly, I think is one of the best vocalists. So it has a very beautiful song. Whenever I walk into my office, you will be able to hear that song. It's very distinctive, but it's also sad to realize that it's almost extirpated in the region. We don't really hear that song in other parts outside of Singapore. Notwithstanding this, Singapore remains one of the strongholds, supporting 1/3 of this population.
1/3 of the whole world's population.
yeah, that's really
Yeah.
impressive
So-
for how small we are. Yeah. And I think for a lot of the listeners, right, one of the questions they'll have is what makes Singapore such a special place for straw-headed bulbuls?
I think it's a mixture of measures that are being put in place, be it from the government or from the organization that we work with, as well as member of public, right? It's the same as to how we put in place surveillance and licensing at our bird shops to make sure that birds that are there are properly obtained with proper license, as well as the measures that we put in place at our border, together with our agencies, Immigration Checkpoint Authority, to intercept illegally smuggled birds. Because apart from illegal wildlife trade, these birds can also bring animal health diseases that we don't want to be introduced into our country. So we do have strict border control to ensure these cases are being stopped at border. But it also saddened me because in 2019, I remember I just joined NParks, and then I was alerted of this case of more than 800 birds being smuggled through land checkpoint at Woodlands. So it was 800 birds. So you can imagine the amount of birds being hidden, stashed within a vehicle. They are all in terrible condition, tightly crammed together. And then when we saw the birds, most of them were actually dead. And it was through the vigilance of our checkpoint officers to stop the vehicle and then do secondary check that we realized that there were so many birds in it. So in Singapore, we do also get seizures of birds coming through the border. And more recently, in 2023, we also stopped 300 birds being smuggled from Malaysia into Singapore. So I would say it's a mixture of all the different measures that the government can put in place, as well as what Mandai Nature has in place, as well as the public outreach and education. Because really, I would believe that most of this bird seized is meant to enter trade as pet, for example, or cage bird trade. So if there's no demand, if nobody is buying it, I mean, there wouldn't be that illegal supply coming in as well. So I think it really takes different stakeholder alike that supply chain to work together to stop this from happening.
So I'm guessing the scale of trade in this region must be pretty huge. What are the impacts of the trade on population of, the songbirds in the region, in the wild?
So I think Renhui mentioned a really good point about the scale. And maybe just to add on to that, when you look at the region, we're talking about hundreds of birds confiscated in Singapore. But as she said earlier, Mandai Nature worked with regional partners in tackling the illegal and unsustainable songbird trade. And the confiscation levels in the region are way, way, way off the charts almost. We're talking about, I think, one confiscation in October was 6,000 birds in one session, right? And then shortly after, the next week, another 3,000 birds were confiscated.
Wow.
So these are in the thousands. Yeah. A huge problem because those numbers show that you can easily wipe out birds, right, from the wild and lead to direct impacts in populations and leading to declines and local extinctions. In fact, in this last 10 years since we started, catalyzing conservation work around songbirds, we've unfortunately seen, extinctions of subspecies of shamas in certain islands in Southeast Asia.
And these adverse effects on wildlife species also have, negative impacts on local communities and people living in and around these wild habitats, right?
Yeah. So the direct removal of birds from the wild leads to also removal of the ecosystem roles that songbirds play. Now, many songbirds are seed eaters, fruit eaters, or insect eaters. So insect-eating songbirds obviously play a role in managing pest population of insects. So they keep pest numbers at a comfortable level, right, without being too much of a problem for humans and other animals. Fruit-eating songbirds obviously consume fruits and help disperse seeds, so they play an important role in seed dispersal and help regenerating the forest, but also cultivated land, that like orchards and stuff, right? And then birds that eat seeds play a role in regulating plant populations. Now, apart from removing these key ecosystem roles that cannot be replaced effectively by people, it also, as you said, it impacts human livelihood. And that's simply because I think the best example to give is ecotourism, or specifically bird watching tourism. In many parts across Southeast Asia, where bird watching is a big thing, either domestically as a tourist activity or internationally, where people pay to go and join a bird watching tour in the region, taking away songbirds from the wild removes the livelihood of those communities that actually are either quite dependent or fully dependent on tourism as a main source of income. And that's really bad because it could mean that by removing that livelihood, you push them towards more illegal activities like illegal habitat clearing or forest clearing or illegal poaching of birds, right, just to supplement their incomes. So sometimes these communities are really in really poor socioeconomic states, and what they're doing is just for their own survival. Balancing that, I think, is really, really important.
Yeah, and I think something that, always shocks me is the value of, bird tourism. It sucks that we have to put a number, economic value on animals, but sometimes that's the only way that people understand.
Yeah.
So, a bird might be worth maybe $15 if it's sold, as a songbird. I mean, obviously a lot of them go for a lot more, but you keep them in the ecosystem, in the habitat, they could go on to generate a lot more revenue for the local communities. It's time for Nature Nuggets. In the spirit of our podcast title, That's Wild, we wanted to ask our guests to recommend something wild that they've come across or enjoyed and that you can check out yourself too.
So I can go first. I go bird watching every year. I do it as often as I can afford to. So I'll recommend that our listeners here take on bird watching as a hobby, try it out, see if something for you. But yeah.
So for me, I would recommend a YouTube video. It's a documentary we did with Net Geo photographer Jaya Prakash, which Elliot was also involved as well. So it's a YouTube video called In Pursuit of Tackling Illegal Wildlife Trade Singapore. So if you want to hear more or learn more about how we are doing this in Singapore, do check this video out.
Right, something that I really enjoyed working on as well. I think a lot of behind the scenes footage into what goes behind, monitoring, trade coming in through our borders and how we tackle the illegal wildlife trade here in Singapore. Right, so just going back to the negative impacts of the illegal wildlife trade, I think from what you mentioned of the many, seizures of lots of birds, being found in containers and things like that, does that suggest that there is domestic demand for these species in Singapore?
Yeah, so illegal wildlife trade is a global crime, like you mentioned at the beginning. So, Singapore being part of the international trade route, we are not being spared from this flow of illegal items that are coming through. So, illegal wildlife trade or wildlife species that are being transported through Singapore or into Singapore. Definitely, we have seen through our seizures. 2019, we seized one of the largest pangolin scales and elephant ivory coming through Singapore, going out to Asia. I would say that apart from being that transshipment point for things that come through, there are also things that are coming into Singapore. We notice that on online platform, we see animals that are being put on advertisement or for sale on chat groups, for example, which from NParks perspective, we are doing our surveillance as well as carrying out sting operations to arrest as well as to seize these items that are being sold online. But one of the things that really concerned me quite a little is also we see a young trend or young people they are being involved and having exotic pets or asking or demanding for exotic pets on online platform as well, together with our outreach program as well as our involvement with youth. This is an area that we are trying to address and also trying to work our best to tackle it.
Right. And to kind of address this problem or issue and to combat the illegal wildlife trade as well as like the illegal songbird trade, what is NParks or Mandai Nature's strategy to tackle such a huge and complex issue?
So Mandai Nature, as you know, we're the conservation arm of the Mandai Wildlife Group that operates the bird paradise. And within the bird paradise, we do have a strategic conservation breeding of songbirds that are threatened by the trade. Example being the Straw-headed Bulbul. We also have species like the greater green leafbird that are threatened elsewhere in the range simply because of the songbird trade that we're breeding and holding an insurance population of, such so when the time is right and when the situations are safe, we could put these birds back into the wild. Mandai Nature also has a different role to play, and we host a specialist group under the IUCN SSC, and that is the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, Species Survival Commissions. And IUCN SSC is the global authority for species, and in this case, it's the Asian Songbird Trade Specialist Group. So we're the conservation authority for songbird conservation, particularly in Asia, but globally. And what this specialist group does is actually create regional strategies for songbirds and how to protect them, not in just one country, because many of these birds are found across many countries. So how do you protect them across borders, right? Recognizing that birds don't recognize political boundaries set by men. We also work at global levels with institutions like the CITES and other global entities to help advise and recommend protection to songbirds at a global scale. As a member of the IUCN SSC, we play a strategic role in changing the red list status of birds. Now, all of you know what a red list is. You have like least concern, vulnerable, endangered, critically endangered, extinct in the wild. So what we do as a specialist group is actually try our best to survey all the birds that are under our care, right, or on our priority list, and see if they actually need change in status. Because, say, for example, in the case of the Straw-headed Bulbul, in the last 10 years, we noticed a substantial decline in populations across its range, and that warranted the uplisting from whatever it was before, right, to critically endangered, which is one step away from extinction. And by changing the red list status of birds, even though it's a negative thing because they're getting more threatened, it does initiate interest in the species and catalyze conservation efforts. So while it's not so nice that they're being more threatened, it's also good in catalyzing conservation work.
Right.
And I think we talk a lot about CITES, but IUCN works very strongly with government parties that are uplisting or proposing birds for uplisting on CITES in supporting and recommending those uplistings. So, for example, back in 2022, when we went to Panama to attend the CITES COP19, the IUCN, supported the uplisting of the Straw-headed Bulbul to CITES 1.
Yeah, so also just to add on to what Jessica has mentioned is that I think what I've learned during the CITES COP meeting is, I think earlier we spoke or touched on the cultural perspective of how songbirds or caged bird trade is being done in the region. I think during the meeting, I have a better appreciation of the different perspective that countries may have on a single topic. The uplisting was definitely not easy, but what I was very grateful and happy to get consensus from the parties that were involved, and they were willing to take the step of giving better protection to this critically endangered bird, which is not easy because they also have their domestic audience to manage and to convince that this is a good step ahead for the bird to ensure it doesn't get extinct. So I think when we talk about international convention, we talk about the measures that we put in place. It's still the people that are behind this and the people that we need to convince. So I think it is a consultative process where we have to work together with parties that are involved, because after all, this may be a livelihood or income generating process for people that are involved. If you want to introduce alternative livelihood, it takes time as well. So I would say that instruments are in place, but at the end of the day, it's also about the people that we need to convince, the people that we need to work together to tackle this very significant global crime.
I think one big area that we need to work on is actually better in situ protection for species and their habitats, because you can't save a species if you don't save their habitats. And working with local communities and or indigenous communities play a really big role. So previously we mentioned the impact of the trade on livelihoods, right? One way to maybe reduce demand for the trade, particularly at source countries where the birds come from, is to shift the need to poach birds for money to, say, ecotourism or birdwatching tourism. Can local communities actually earn maybe even more money, right? And sustain themselves, right, from birdwatching tourism, putting more value on the bird in the wild rather than the bird in the cage.
Right. So considering how complex the illegal wildlife trade is, I'm quite sure NParks has a broader strategy that encompasses a lot of other different efforts to target such a pressing issue.
So in Singapore, we adopt a whole of government approach to combat illegal wildlife trade. Enforcement has to be anchored with a robust legislative framework. So in Singapore, the Endangered Species Act is the principal legislation that fulfills our obligation under CITES. So the ESA for short has been amended in 2022 to increase its penalty from 2 years to 6 years for illegal trafficking of Appendix 1 species, the most critically endangered species. And for monetary fine, we have increased it from 50,000 per species to 100,000 per specimen. So apart from that, it's about illegal wildlife trade being a cross-border crime. It really requires a significant amount of international cooperation. So for us in Singapore, we are actively involved in CITES meeting. We are also on the board of the Interpol Wildlife Crime Working Group. This is where we forge and foster cooperation with international community and governments, because quite a lot of things come through Singapore, and we have to put in place a robust risk assessment framework to make sure illegal items are being flagged so that we are able to open or intercept containers that are coming through. In 2019, we had 3 major seizures totaling over 37 tons of pangolin scales and close to 9 tons of elephant ivory. This seizure was made possible through intelligence that were provided by our counterpart. So we were able to bring the container off the vessel that was transiting Singapore. I guess the question is what happened to those seizures, right? So for us and NParks, we saw the opportunity to also study the specimens that were being seized. So through our Center for Wildlife Forensic, we were actually able to do a molecular analysis of the specimen. And from there, apart from identifying the species, we are also able to have better resolution of where the elephants were taken from in Africa. What this really means is that it allows countries that are upstream to take enforcement measures to stop poaching, as well as to give us information in terms of how our seizure is linked to seizures that were made in other countries. We are able to feedback this information to government's authority. And hopefully, with all this information that are provided, we can eventually, with better resolution and connecting the different seizures together, we can bring down the syndicates that are moving things around.
Just bringing us back to the large-scale seizures, right? How has Singapore really tightened our legislation or regulations around wildlife trade to make sure that these instances don't happen so often in the future?
Apart from the all-of-government approach that Singapore takes to tackle the illegal and unsustainable wildlife trade, I think it's also really good that the governments actually, or agencies actually engage the community. And in this case, for the Wildlife Act and the Endangered Species Act, the nature community was engaged in the review, which shows that different perspectives is brought to the table, which makes us a less likely place for illegal and unsustainable wildlife trade to take place in the future.
And talking about collaborations. You mentioned that both of you were in Panama in 2022. Is this another example of, collaboration between specifically, Mandai Nature and NParks?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Conference of Parties happens once every 3 years. This is the meeting where government, authority, NGOs, private sector come together to discuss about uplisting of species into the CITES appendix. So one of the things that we did in the last Conference of Party was to uplist the Straw-headed Bulbul to CITES Appendix 1 and the white rum shama to CITES Appendix 2. So this was a species that we took effort to consult stakeholders very widely because it's a trade that it's happening in the region. To put a full commercial trade prohibition may result in industry being completely closed down, right? So there's quite a lot of lobbying that happened during that process.
I've never spoken so much in my life for 2 weeks at the Conference of Party.
So apart from Straw-headed Bulbul, where I spent a lot of time talking to various stakeholders, we also put out a proposal jointly with Malaysia on the white rum shama. So the white rum shama, it's proposed to be put on CITES Appendix 2. So I touched on CITES Appendix 1 where commercial trade is prohibited. On CITES Appendix 2, what it means is that the bird species require a CITES permit whenever it is being traded. So this is the point that Jessica mentioned where when bird species are put on CITES Appendix 2, the volume of trade is being tracked, is being monitored to ensure that trade that is happening in a sustainable volume and it doesn't result in species overexploitation.
Even though the the Conference of Parties was only 2 weeks, even ahead of the COP, NParks and organizations like Mandai Nature had to help agencies put proposals together, right? Generate the data needed because all these proposals have to be evidence-based or data-based to show that, trade is actually impacting wild populations. So it's a proposal that's put in a year before. So a lot of work went into that. There's a lot of lobbying with NGOs or non-government organizations globally as well to support and get their governments to support, right, the uplisting of the 2 proposed species. But for us, as the IUCN SSC Asian Songbird Trade Specialist Group, this was even earlier. So in 2015, when the first strategy for Asia, right, the conservation of songbirds in Asia came out, we already proposed that white rum shama should be uplisted to a CITES appendix, in this case 2. We also proposed that the Straw-headed Bulbul should be uplisted from CITES 2 to CITES 1. So that was 7 years. And it took us 7 years to create, the right information, generate the right data, lobby with the governments across Southeast Asia, and work collectively as, a conservation network in the region to ultimately have the information ready to put in the proposals so the birds will be uplisted. It goes to show that, one thing that Renhui touched on, conservation needs partnership, right, amongst NGOs, amongst government and non-government agencies. And it also takes a long time. So conservation doesn't happen overnight. So we're very warm that, that 7 years of work and then a more intensive 1 year and 2 weeks of lobbying, right, ultimately led to the 2 successful proposals. And the 2 proposals, it was the first time NParks actually proposed a species for uplisting at the CITES Conference of Parties.
Right.
Yes, so it's really quite
monumental.
Yes, so it's monumental and it was really treading in unknown waters as well, right? Because, notwithstanding that the issue has been talking for 7 years, but it really requires a lot of convincing to the other government agencies to be on board with us to make it a successful uplisting process.
It's a long and tedious process, but I'm quite sure the outcome, makes it all worth it. Yeah. So you guys both are doing amazing work, but what can the ordinary person, maybe our audience listening, what can they do to contribute to the fight against illegal wildlife trade?
I think earlier on I talked about the seizures that we encounter at borders. I think, again, if there is no demand, one of the key drivers of illegal wildlife trade is the demand. So I would urge our listener, if you are buying a songbird, do get it from licensed pet shops. In addition to that, if you see any poaching or illegal activity or smuggling activities, always reach out to NParks so that we can be alerted and take the necessary action that is supported by our enhanced legislation.
So on top of, helping with reporting, right, and the proper buying of birds at pet shops. I think the listeners also who are keen to contribute to songbird conservation can also donate to conservation projects, in Singapore or the region. If you notice a bird or songbird particularly that is injured or hurt, be sure to call CITES or NParks to get it rescued, rehabilitated and released. And simple things that schools and communities could do, and even individuals, if you have a garden or a balcony, is to plant bird-friendly plants that would, serve as food resources or nesting resources for our local songbirds.
Yeah, and also for our general public as well as youth, right? So in NParks, we have kickstarted the CITES Global Youth Network. It's a youth-led program that is supported by NParks to provide a platform to engage youth on wildlife trade, to understand the intricacy of sustainable wildlife trade from an early age. And eventually, when they become decision maker at the CITES COP meeting, for example, they can better understand each other's perspective and come to a common landing point or a solution that can work for various parties. So this CITES Global Youth Network, we are running our global summit, where we will bring together international youths to Singapore to talk about the issues they are facing in their country, as well as some of the possible mechanisms that can be used, for example, in CITES to tackle some of these issues. Every 3rd March is the World Wildlife Day. So it's a day where we commemorate sustainable wildlife trade and wildlife conservation. So we will also have our regional symposium running during that time. Well, it's an event, again, youth-led, supported by NParks. So I also urge our listeners, especially our young listeners, to look out for such events and to participate actively in it, because I think you really need to learn and understand each other's perspective in order to better protect the species.
And maybe a shameless pitch, whether you're younger or older, volunteer at the National Parks Board or at Mandai Nature and help contribute to conservation.
Yes.
Thank you both so much for joining us on this podcast. And it's really comforting to know that we have such dedicated and passionate individuals fighting the illegal wildlife trade. I hope for our listeners, this has really inspired you to dive deeper into such an interesting topic and also a very pressing issue, and do your part to fight the illegal wildlife trade as well. Thank you for listening to this episode of That's Wild. If you would like to hear more, please tune in for more episodes on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. And if you like our content, don't forget to show your support by hitting the follow button and giving us a 5-star rating.
Bye. Thanks for listening.